Harris. Greg Lee back with us, KTVU political analyst. Brian Sobel also on board. Fairly civil debate tonight, I think, maybe because the two sides trying to get that middle base here. Did one or the other do just that?
I think they both spoke to their bases. Remember, the race is down to 3 or 4% in the middle. The question is whether the vice presidential debate would have moved anybody. Probably not in the bigger picture.
But the timing of it is interesting when we talk about it being the last, being the only. I mean, normally when you don't have what's happened over the last several months, you would have had more time to hear from both the candidates. Do we think, though, that because there's no extra presidential debate, because we're at this very tight time frame, that this might end up being more impactful than we think?
Well, I think it's going to get a lot of discussion because it is the other debate.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that people may have gotten to the end of the debate, and Greg and I were talking about this, is questionable. Because if you got to the end, that question that J.D. Vance couldn't answer was pretty critical, as was the earlier question to Tim Walz about Tiananmen Square, which he didn't get right.
And there's no question J.D. Vance was obviously better suited for this kind of format. He has practiced. He's done a ton of interviews. He knows how to command this audience. Tim Walz came off nervous, right? And he came out kind of unsure of himself. He picked it up and did the best when he was going after former President Trump, when he was speaking about abortion, topics that are important to him. And to Brian's point, people clamor for debate between the presidential candidates. They say, I just wish we heard more policy. Well, you got it tonight. But the question is, a lot of people texted me and said, this is kind of boring. And the best stuff from Walz came during that exchange at the end. So did people make it to the end, or how does the campaign now use that exchange?
So you think someone missed an opportunity here? As you said, it was boring. There was no pop, whether it was Walz or Vance.
Well, I think with Walz, what you saw
to be a little louder.
Yeah, there was a lot of civility, which is, for Brian and I, perhaps a nice return to some body politics that this country has known in the past. But I think for the purposes of their campaign that sort of paint Donald Trump and J.D. Vance as existential threats to democracy, him saying to J.D. Vance on a number of occasions, I agree with you. Being sort of Minnesota nice. That is going to not pair with what the campaign necessarily wants.
But people have talked about wanting policy, but also there's been so much going into this about favorability rating. Do we like them? Did that change, and does that move the needle? And we were talking about the small number of points we have between both these candidates. Is that really what's going to make these voters who are still on the fence decide?
Why I think they're still on the fence is J.D. Vance came across as the everyman, very likable, and I'm not Vance, Walz, and J.D. Vance came across as somebody who wasn't as high-strung as he's been described as, and also was very calm in his answers and in his statements. So it was this, what we expected.
And tonight, for the first time, we can say the election is next month.
Right.
So, moving forward, will we be talking about this debate in 4 weeks? Will the voters at home be talking about this debate? And how does this? How do you foresee it in the next 4 or 5 weeks?
Ballots in California are going out next week.
Right. People are voting.
20 states
across the country.
People already have their ballots. And I think, to Brian's point, there's such a small number, and almost to me a misidentified number, because I think it's even smaller than we think, of people who are actually undecided to this point. I think what it comes down to is young, first-time voters, also people that may be disaffected Republicans that weren't going to vote at all. So can you, if you're Democrats, mobilize them, or vice versa?
And it always comes down to turnout. And we don't know yet what the turnout will be. But again, I think Walz was a very interesting subject tonight. We don't know anything about him. And J.D. Vance, I think a lot of people learned a little bit more about him. Two completely different people.
Got it. Brian, Greg, appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely.
And you at home can weigh in on who you think won this debate tonight on KTVU.com. Nearly 3,000 people have already voted, with 53% saying they think J.D. Vance actually won tonight's debate, 47% going with Tim Walz. All you have to do to vote is just scan that QR code, or you can always go to KTVU.com/vote.
Well, students of politics at the University of San Francisco